also came, so then, so okay.
Yes, sir.
Sanjeevani, Sai Sudhir and Tejveer. Tejveer. Okay. So yeah, we already started recording. Okay. So you just always go through the list of things like what are the OS layer, what are the data configuration side, what are the IP addresses ranges, okay, and default subnet mask, network and host portions, what are the devices, what are the type of networks, what is network, cables, NIC, MAC address. These are all continuously you have to go through it. So, but here last class we discussed about IP addresses and their ranges. Okay. Address classes. Out of that one, only unicast IP addresses only we discussed. So we given ranges as well as network and host portions. And also we discuss how subnet mask is working, how to get a network ID and host ID kind of stuff. So what is the message? Screen is not visible. Now it is visible.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So this is the ranges, but also last class we discussed about a private IP address. But I didn't tell more details about a private IP address. Then now I will tell. Class A private IP address is, range is 10.0.0.0 to 10.255.255.255. If you check in some internet, there are some textbooks. So how it shows like a 10.0.0.1. So 10.255.255.254. You know why it is? It is in this network 10.0 network. This is the first IP address to configure to the host. This is the last IP address to the configure to host between 10.0.0.1, 10.0.0.2, 10.0.0.3 like that it keep goes. This is the last IP address. You can assign to the computer devices. This is full range. This is full range. Class B 172 16.
.0.0 minus
It is
172.
small difference is there. That is 31.
31.
Remember that one 31.
55.
255, 255. Very good. Class C private IP.
192.168.0.0 minus 192.168.255.255.
Okay. Normally, class C, this is the network portion. Okay, but this is not a this is a network portion correctly. But only thing is, this is like this only. So first two portions only same. Remaining will be changes in the class C. It does not mean network portion and all. For example, 192.168.1.10, 192.168.0.10. Both are different networks. Both are different networks. Only private range is this must be. Okay, and here it is also remember 170 to 16, but here is 170 to 31. Okay. That's the difference. But what is this private? What is this private? And what is the meaning of public? So I am in a private network. So I am in a currently I am in office. I came to office today after a long time. Okay, so that's a little late. Okay, traveling. So I am in my office or maybe in a home. So then this is my private network. This is my private network. Importance of private network is, what is the private network is? We can communicate within this private network only. Okay. The private IP address cannot communicate outside. Means if I send packet to a google.com. Okay. Where is the google.com? Somewhere in the world, right? So New Jersey or maybe San Jose, something, somewhere it is. I think New Jersey, google.com is there. It's somewhere in the public. So I send a packet through my ISP provider. So ISP provider forward the packet to the google.com. I can able to access google.com because it is in a public. Google.com cannot send a packet to me directly without my request. Google.com cannot send a packet to me. I have to send a request. Then only I will receive a thing. Why? Because of google.com don't know where I'm located. Google.com don't know my IP address. Generally, communication, source to destination communication. Source will communicate to destination, right? So, source to destination. When you are communicating, you have to tell source IP address, destination IP address. So destination knows your IP address. In general, that is what we discussed earlier. But here, this is my source, this is my destination, but destination don't know, don't understand what is my IP address because I'm in a private. So it is little confusion. So how it is don't understand, how it will understand, both we will discuss. Again, we'll back to the private. Private means we can communicate within your LAN network. We can communicate within the LAN network. LAN network. Valid only in LAN. Exactly say LAN. Even if you have configured a WAN kind of network also, that is also private. LAN means it is meaning is local. Okay. Not public. Okay, communicate within the LAN. So that is the private IP address. So these are all not routable, non-routable in a public. For example, in a public, there are a lot of routers are there. We already use trace RT command. So the routers in the public communication and your google.com, facebook.com, they're all having public IP address only. These are only works in a private network only. So that is a purely private IP address. The question is, I have a private IP, right? So I'm checking my IP address. How to check IP address? IP config.
IP config.
So this is my IP address. So I change my network, my IP address is changed. See, this is my IP address. This is the private IP address. But I'm getting internet. I'm talking to you. I can open google.com, youtube.com. Okay, like that, right? So how I'm able to communicate in the public? So what will happen here? This is my ISP, Internet Service Provider. The packet sent finally reaches to ISP provider. ISP provider put a public IP address and send a forward the packet. So my computer don't have any public IP address. My company don't have any public IP address. Simply for packet is forward to ISP. ISP provider forward a packet to public with public IP address. Means so they will put a list. So this is the computer. They put my IP address and public IP address. They will map here and forward the packet. To communicate in a public, you need a public IP address. To communicate in a internet, you need a public IP address. Without public IP address, you can't communicate. Very simple. But we don't have any public IP address, but still we can able to communicate. You know, that is, we should not show here, but try to show you. So, sometimes we ask a people question, that is, what is your IP address? Immediately they'll go Google it. So what is my IP address? Okay, they'll Google it. What is my IP address? They see this IP address and they will tell, this is my public IP address. Okay, how I got this public IP address? Because of ISP provider. The google.com, facebook.com don't know your local IP address. That is your private IP address. Even they know your private IP address, they can't do anything with your private IP because of this similar IP address in this world. There is a billions of people are using same IP address. Okay, that's because it's a completely local. In your home, you can wear anything. It's a public compulsory. You have to having a public IP address. Again, so we'll go back to the previous thing. For example, I have a server. Okay, I have a server. So this is a web server. This is some web server. I build a web server in my organization or in my home. So these people want to communicate. So APC, VPC, CPC are there. They want to communicate web server. Okay. So we don't require any public IP address because my web server is in my office. My computer is also in my office only. So I don't require any public IP. I no need to take permission to use IP address, private IP address. Remember that one, private IP address. Not required any license or a permissions or a purchasing kind of stuff, not required. Public IP address, you have to purchase it, you have to buy. Buying is not there, actually it is rent only. You have to use IP address, you have to take license for IP address from ICANN. Regional service providers are there, so you have to take public IP address. Okay, it's not like you can use any IP address, is not there, so you have to check what are the IP addresses are not yet used. You have to go for it. So how to get the public IP address? Like you can go to your regional IANA or ISP provider. Through ISP also you can buy. Service providers are there. So this is very simple how to buy. India. IPv6, IPv4, both you can purchase it. Okay. So you can buy static IP address. This is wrong. Okay. The static is not that one. So you have to buy a public IP address. To ISP will assign internet connection dedicated IP address, same as every time like that it is showing. This is, you have to go AppNic. Okay, this is Asia specific AppNic, it is there. So then, okay, go to AppNic, get IP address. I need more information first. Okay, like this, you have to go to follow the things and you have to submit kind of stuff. Okay, so what kind of network you want it? So based on that, you have to pay sign up fee, annual membership fee is also there. Okay, so this is going to Australia, but Apnic India is also there. Asia specific is there. Asia place is also there. Just you can try Indian registry for internet name and numbers. But best is always go through any ISP providers because we don't fee structure is there. Okay, so affiliation fee 27,000 base 3. Okay, IIP fee, IPv6 fee. IPv4 is lesser cost and IPv6 become more cost because of number of IP addresses in IPv6 is very high. So actually it should be reversed, but the people are doing because maintenance cost is high. This is iron. So like this you can go. Why I told best is through ISP provider because of lot of websites in available websites. We don't know whether it is genuine or not. You applied in you purchase, you paid an amount, but you didn't get anything. But yeah, yes. And that too, your public IP should be added to your through ISP only. Okay, so a lot of configurations are required. So that is what public IP you have to buy. You have to pay rent for every year. You have to pay how many IP addresses you are using or what are the network you are using based on that one. Okay, so here again to communicate this server through your PCs, you don't require any public. Next, there is a client or someone in the network internet. Okay, there is a people who are connected in the internet. They want to communicate to your web server. They can't communicate because you are in a private network. Okay, although you are connected to internet, that is not enough. Your IP must be public IP address. If you are having a public IP address, then others in the internet, through internet, people can able to communicate to your server. So in that case, yes, we need a public IP address. Got the point or not? Or can I go last point again? A simple point. Your server in the private, to communicate from these PCs, you don't require any public IP address because you are in a local private network only. But someone in the network, someone in the internet, okay, through internet, you want your server to be accessed through internet. You need a public IP address. Okay, for internal communication or internet communication, private. For internet communication or public communication, you want to get communicated, you want to get request from outside, you want to get request from outside. So then you will reply. In the cases, compulsory public IP address is required. And it is enough. Okay, got the point, guys? Private and public difference. What is NAT? Network address translation. network address translation. What is this network address translation? It maps local IP address to global, or you can easily say it maps your private IP address to public IP address. Okay, local, global, inside, outside. Okay, so there is a words are there. So inside means internal, inside to outside, local to global. Like these are words are there. Local means internal one, global means your public network. Okay, local network to global network, or a public network. Okay, inside network to outside network communication. These are different words are there. Very simple to understand. It maps your private IP address, means your local network to public IP address. Okay, so what it will do here in this one, in this case, what I am doing here in the same diagram only, instead of putting a public IP address to my web server, I keep a private IP only, just for security reasons, you can say. Okay, or maybe already I configured as a private, so I don't want to connect my server directly to the public. Okay, what I am doing is I put a router. So router also do this job. What I am doing is in router we configure a NAT in NAT configuration. So this is having its own private IP address, and outside communication we communicate with the public IP address. Like this. So when it is this user send a request to my public IP, this NAT network address translation translate to private and forward packet to the route server, and server received and reply. Then the router do NAT kind of stuff, network address translation, and send as a public. Okay, so this is a NAT, network address translation. What is NAT? Network address translation means, for example, my server is having some IP address, for example, private IP address. This is my private IP address. And my public IP address is, for example, 200.10.10.22, just for example. Okay, this is a public IP address. What are the public IP addresses? Those very simple. What are the public IP addresses? These are our private, other than private IP addresses, other than restricted IP addresses. Some IP address like APIPA IP address are there now, other than APIPA address, and then private IP address. All IP addresses are public IP address only. Okay, so there is no range for a public IP address. Only range for private IP address, APIPA 127.0.0.1 and 0 series, 127 series, 169.254 series. Okay, and these private IP address ranges, except these, all remaining IP addresses are public IP address only. So what it is NAT is doing, this is my server IP address, but in public it will tell like this only. Okay, so NAT, network address translation, is one-to-one type. Okay, one private IP address is binded to one public IP address only. one private to one public IP address. For example, I have a multiple servers are there. Same thing only. Server or a PCs, anything. One to one only. It means I have a server having IP address. This is a server having an IP address, and a public one another IP address. Like now I have two servers, two public IP addresses. Okay, two servers, two private IP addresses, two public IP addresses. So this is NAT, network address translation. Guys understand? Are any doubts?
सर एक बार फिर से समझा दीजिए.
You want to repeat?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Very simple. I have a server or a client, whatever the machine is there. I want to get communicated. So you are communicating, you are sending a packet to google.com. So google.com is giving you reply, right? But google.com not directly deliver any packet. You don't give any information to you directly. Very simple, right? So like you open a youtube.com or maybe facebook.com, then only you are getting a information. Okay. So we can't get a packet directly. So for example, you build your own web server or even one Facebook kind of server or maybe authentication server like that. You have your own server is there. Okay. You build your own website. You put it in your home or office. You want to get communicated. Means I want to send. I want to see your website through internet. We are not sitting in the same place, right? So we are not in the same office or same network. Through internet, I want to ask you like I want to see your website. I can't see why, because you are in your own private. Your IP address is private IP. It is non-routable IP address. So it cannot be root in a public. Private IP addresses cannot root in public. No public access. So through internet, your IP address cannot be accessed. Okay, because it's a purely internal network only. Now, what you think is you want to get access from public, means through internet. I want to access your web server. So what you done, you put a device is like a router. So you can use your router here. In a router, I done a configuration. What is that configuration? I put a public IP address to my router. So I purchase some public IP addresses. I put a public IP address to my router. Okay. So I put a public IP address to my router and I configure any request. If you receive any request, this particular public IP address, you got any packet to this public IP address, translate into this particular private IP address and forward the packet. So for example, here it is, I put a last is 22. This is also 22. Of course, this is 192 series. This is 200 series, whatever it is. So if I receive a packet, okay, so I am communicating with this IP address. This is the public IP address. I send a request to this IP address. It reaches here. Now this router, what it will do, it translate into this IP address. It maps, right? So it is translate into this IP address and forward the packet. Now your server is received a packet and send a reply. Internet disconnected. Now, okay. Guys, can you able to see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, when you are sending, this is your source packet up to your router only. Okay, after your router, this is your source packet. Okay, this is the maybe easy. You're sending packet from S1 to some destination. Okay, so your source IP at your server is like this. This is your source IP address. But when you cut your router, so network address translation, translate your source IP address into like this and forward the packet to further. Destination IP address not changing here. You received a packet from D1 to S1. Okay, so whenever you receiving a packet from through internet, okay, your destination, the packet destination D1 to S1 destination IP address is this one up to your router. But in a router, NAT will change the destination IP address to like this. So what is the meaning of this one? Okay, it forward finally. Okay, so this is called a network address translation. So in a public, you communicate with a public IP address, but internally it is a private IP address. NAT is a protocol which is we configured in a router. It do translation, network address translations. Okay, this is my private, this is my public. But NAT, in a NAT, we have a only static NAT, dynamic NAT, NAT overload. That is called a PAT. Okay, NAT overload. So we see that one NAT overload. First, static NAT. So one-to-one communication type. So you have an internal private IP address is one. So one public IP address. For each private IP, so there is a public IP address. Means you have a 10 private IP addresses, 10 public IP addresses are required. Okay. So in a static, okay, so 10 private IP addresses are there. How many public IP addresses required? 10 public IP addresses are required. There is no saving of public IP addresses here, but we have to use 10 public IP addresses. Only thing is for security. So you don't want to put your private IP address kind of stuff. You don't need to worry about your private IP address. Simply NAT will translate your private IP address to public IP address. That is a static NAT. Dynamic NAT. Dynamic NAT is different. Like a dynamic NAT is like here. Okay. Dynamic NAT little bit we have to. It's nothing but a static only. So there is no difference between dynamic and static. For example, I take a 10 private IP addresses and 5 public IP addresses. Simultaneously, only 5 IP addresses only translated. Okay. So in a dynamic NAT, I took a 10 private IP, 10 servers are there, but I have only 5 public IP addresses. Okay. So at a time, 5 private IP addresses only translate public, or you can say only 5 servers can able to communicate at a time. This is little bit saving of private IP address. Like you have 100 computers, not all 100 is not required. So only 5 servers may communicate at a time. So I will take a public 5 only. Okay, remaining will be weighted because your session layer is there. So once translation is completed, okay, so this is communication is done, then next one will communicate. Okay, like the one by one, not at a time. Okay, so at a time only 5 private IP address only translate to public, remaining in a waiting list. So once communication is completed, then next one will go. This is NAT. But interesting one is NAT overload. I said it is also called as a PAT. PAT means port address translation. Port address translation. NAT overload, also called as a PAT. PAT means port address translation. So what it is? Port address translation is many private to one public IP address. So dynamic is many to many, but this is many to one. This is many to one. So I have a 10 private IP addresses. I overload on a one single public only. Okay. All 10 private IP address translate, or we can say communicate to public. Okay, so all systems will communicate in a public. So this is NAT overload. Meaning is I have a lot of devices. All are want to communicate internet. Okay, all are want to communicate internet. Want to communicate internet, not communicated by internet. It is we are just all we want to communicate internet. So we are using internet broadband connections, right? We are using a broadband connection. So how it is works? All these IP addresses forward outside with a single public IP address. Single public IP address. You have your own individual private IP addresses, but packet is forward with a single public only. So that's why if anyone is in the network, for example, this PC in the internet, they want to communicate to your PC, they cannot communicate. They can't communicate because of one public IP for multiple PCs. So which PC is your? No one knows. Okay. People will get doubts or will getting hacked kind of stuff. Directly you won't get hacked because no one knows your private IP address first of all. If anyone knows the public IP address, even that is also not binded to one single PC, right? Here it is binded to single PC. Okay, single system, but single IP address. But this is multiple systems are translated to single public IP address. Okay, so this is what it is going on with this. I'm not saying you cannot be hackable, but I am saying this is not directly knowing of your IP address. Based on that, we can't hack you. So that is not with a MAC address, not with your private IP address, guarantee. Public IP address, there is a 1% chance, is one very less chance also, because of that is not belongs to anyone. For example, I got my public IP address, my laptop having public IP address, my mobile phone having same public IP address. Okay, so I have 10 computers here, 10 computers may shows. Okay, same public IP address only. Okay, so that is what I'm trying to say is. Okay, so this is PAT, very simple. NAT, network address translation. It translates or maps your local IP address to public IP address, your local IP address or a private IP address to public IP address. Network address translation. Next. So one private, one public type of NAT is there, that is called static NAT. So I have a 10 servers, means 10 private IP addresses. So you want to put all the 10 into the public. So we need a 10 public IP address, and NAT is 10 to 10, 1 to 1. You have to give the translations. Dynamic means you have a 10 servers are there, so 10 private IP addresses are there, but you have only 5 public. Then what you do? Dynamic NAT overload, or PAT, port address translation. So you have a 10 private IP addresses, but you have only one public IP address. You want to communicate outside. You have to communicate to outside. You can communicate with the one single public IP address only. We are all using PAT only, port address translation. We are not directly using. Our router is doing that PAT kind of stuff. Routers, ISP providers will take care of your port address translations. Okay, port address translation. They purchase 10 or 15 public IP addresses. So almost all lot of customers are doing. So, but how it is possible? All or many private IP addresses to single public IP addresses. So how it is translate? It is look like this one. This is my private IP address. Okay, and this is my public IP address. For example, this is my public IP address. What it will do? It assigns some port number, a random number, something. It's not like exact port number also. So it stores in the server, means NAT server or router. It stores all this one. It will store up to session is completed. Again, you send another request, another translation will be created. For example, I have another machine, so it assigns something differently, different port numbers. So it will understand what is your request. So what are there? So this is a kind of stuff. But in all these things, how many public IP addresses I am using? Check it. How many private IP addresses? How many public IP addresses are there? Anyone? How many public IP addresses? How many private IP addresses are there? I asked a question. How many private IP addresses, how many public IP addresses are used in this translation?
4 private and 1 public.
Very good. 4 private, 1 public IP address, I used it. Okay. So how it is works based on the port numbers. Based on the port number, port address translation. Port number, port address translation. So meaning is it will assign port numbers to the IP address and store in the router and forward the packet when it is received it. It understand, so this is mapped to this one, we'll get it. It is a one-way communication, guys. It is one-way type, means you can send request and receive response. Okay, you send request and receive response. Okay, for example, you have a server, you want to receive a request from the public, you can't, because no one knows what is your original IP address here. Okay, so in a public means our internet broadband connections, in our broadband connections, you received a, whenever you received a packet with your public, but who is your private? Who is your original server? There is a 10 or 20 servers are there, or 10 or 20 machines are there. Okay, who is your device? You received a packet through public, but to retranslate into the private, so who is it one? We don't know. But when you are sending a request, it binds already what is your request, what is source IP address, what is your source IP address, destination IP address, and public IP address wise, it stores in the router. Then it will forward. When it is received, based on your request and session ID, you will receive the packet. Okay, you receive the packet. So that is what packet port address translation will work. You can send a request and receive a response. And generally, can't get packet or a request directly from internet. Okay, so this is the point. Okay, directly you won't get any packet because you don't. PAT don't understand anything. It don't understand who is actually asking. There is, you are not sending with the port, right? So there is no dedicated ports also not there. There is another networking related commands are there. So one of the command is Netstat. Okay, it is Netstat. It is a Netstat, network address translation. Sorry, Netstat, network statistics or a status. So you can see this local address and foreign address is showing. Okay, so the destination request with HTTPS request I am sending, and this is my local address. Can you see the port numbers? Maybe I open a lot of other servers also. There is showing same thing. Otherwise, I will open a new fresh. I open w3schools.com. So yeah, so another thing. Again, just refresh. Okay. So it is. Can you see the port numbers here? These are random port numbers only, not dedicated port numbers. There are generated random port numbers. Once your session is completed, automatically the translation will be removed and re-establish again. So like that. So this is to see not only it's not only about a port number NAT address translation. It is about your IP address and destination IP address, the port mapping. I'm just stopping this one. Control C. The command is Netstat. Okay, the command is Netstat. Network address translation. So this is about your private IP addresses and as well as what is the difference between what is private and what is public, NAT and PAT kind of stuff. Network address translation, port address translation. It maps local IP address to public IP address. PAT is generally used by ISP provider. Okay, ISP provider. So they will assign an IP address. They will maintain your public IP address. Okay, so they will map private to public IP addresses. Even though you check it, trace RT. So I am just pinging to google.com. Okay, means I am sending a trace RT packet tracing command. See this public IP address. But it is packet is go to my router and ISP provider. Once I reach my ISP provider, okay, from ISP provider packet will send with the public IP address only. Okay, it is done. So it is finally we reach the destination. Can you see all our public IP address? You may get a private IP address from when you are doing from your laptop in starting, but later it is become a public only. Why private in starting? These are public only, but sometimes some people will get a private IP address also. There is a reason because of, let's say internally in IASP, still they are using some private. It is jumping to private only inside internal. But when it is go to the public communication, is always public IP addresses are required. So that's it. The private is for internal communication, public for external communications. So you want to communicate, you want internet connection, you need a public IP address, which is taken care by normally ISP providers using a PAT technique, port address translation technique. You want to get communicate or you want to communicate to outside or you want to get communicated from outside to inside. So you need a public IP address, dedicated public IP address is required. Okay. So you want to map your private to public. So you can use NAT technique, network address translation. It maps your private to public IP address. But static NAT is one single private to one single public. So locally you are a private IP address, but we are communicating outside it, you have a one public IP address. Dynamic NAT is a multiple servers with a multiple public IP addresses. Port address translation or network overload, multiple private IP address to single public IP address. So this is what I am trying to say. Okay, that's it. Next one we will see what is the modem. Okay, what is firewall? What is use of modem? What is the firewall? What is SOHO? SOHO. Okay, means simple office, home office kind of stuff. Okay, what is modem in that one? What is access point? So these are all terminologies. We'll see once. Okay, take a break for at 5 minutes only. Just have some water and all.